I think that it needs to be something to protect the renters here in Palo Alto. For us not to have as much measures in place as other cities like Mountain View, which is on the ballot this year, I think it's ridiculous. So I think that this is one of those issues that should have been solved a long time ago, but it hasn't. So let's get over it. Let's talk about what we can do now. What can we do now in the future, right now, and next year, and next year, and next year to fix it? So I believe that we need to revise how we look at rental protection.
What do you mean when you by rental protection?
Yeah, we need to drill down on that quite a bit here.
Does that include rent control or rent stabilization or capping increase of rents? Or
I think that rent control can get a little dicey, and I believe that now you have the city that's telling a apartment owner that you can only charge so much, you can't get that much profit. I think that's a little bit bold for city government to tell a renter. So I think rental caps, I believe that we can look at some options of that, but I don't think that needs to be something mandated by the city. Rental protections, what I mean are having more protection on the lease. I mean that the renters need to make sure that they're in a situation if they do get evicted from their apartment or told that they're going to change it into condos, that they're given some type of stability from or some type of assistance from their owner of their apartment building. Some moving expenses, more than 45 days notice or even 6 months notice. How about let them know if you're planning to sell this building when you're renting your apartment? So I believe that those type of things need to be in place. Just talk to your renter.
Do you think relocation assistance should be restricted to those making below area median income, or should it be for all levels?
Good question. I know that council looked at that, and
there's different opinions on that.
I'll tell you once again, blunt. I think you don't help one person one way and help another person another way. You help all the people the same way. So if you're going to offer rental assistance, you offer rental assistance. Because someone may be very well in their bank account doesn't mean that they don't need the same assistance as anyone else.
The R1 neighborhoods, they're a jewel, and those of us who are lucky enough to live in them have a great appreciation for their walkability and, seeing neighbors and the green space. I mean, I feel extraordinarily lucky to live, in a single family neighborhood. I'm also really glad that we have the opportunity now, anyone, not just people with really large lots, to build an ADU for your personal circumstances, whether it's, providing space for a family member or whether it's, allowing a space for caregivers as we age, providing space for students. I can't tell you how many emails I get from people who their kids are going to Foothill or Stanford or Santa Clara and they need a place to live, that kind of thing. I'm super excited. I'm very glad that we've done that. And I realize that it's difficult for some people because it may change, their backyard a little bit. It's trickier right in an Eichler, right, and I live in an Eichler, so certainly we should do things at the margins. Beyond the ADUs, I'm not particularly comfortable, adding extra density in the single family neighborhoods. Not just because it changes the character, but because we don't have the transportation infrastructure to get people anywhere, right? Again, I live on Ross Road, and with our bike boulevard, it's really brought into relief that not everyone can ride a bike. So I would really prefer to have a denser housing, and I don't think that differentiates me from just about anybody, closer to transit.
Would you be willing to give up on the 50-foot height limit under certain circumstances?
Under certain circumstances, yes. The same that others have discussed. Affordable housing, and that means 80% or below on BMR, and very near transit. So maybe something like a quarter mile. I'm willing to consider with an open mind in those circumstances. But I want to say the 50-foot height limit has actually served us very well, and I'm grateful to the people, who thought ahead and put it in place. The reality is, homes, at that time might have cost $200,000, whereas today they're 20 times that. So I think it's reasonable at the margins, from an affordability standpoint, to consider relaxing them.
So just to be clear, you said 80%, and I'm not sure what you were referencing, whether that was 80% of median income or whether you're saying that you would be
80% of median income.
Right. So you wouldn't limit that dense a development to BMR units, to subsidized housing units. You would open it up to market rate housing, but somehow try to have that aimed at the 80% number?
No, I don't think I've been clear. So I'm talking about affordable housing the way Palo Alto Housing Corporation does it, right? They use their credits and they set the limit. So anything.
So subsidized housing
Yes.
is what you're talking about?
Yes, sorry, just to be clear.
Okay. So are there any circumstances where you would support going above the 50-foot height limit for market rate housing?
I don't think so. Not that I know of now, but if someone came forward with an unbelievable proposal that had a really significant number of BMR units, I'm willing to look at it. I'm not saying yes or no now.
You mentioned a few minutes ago accessory dwelling units as like a positive step on the housing front. When the council discussed it and adopted a new ordinance, there was sharp dissent from 4 colleagues who felt that the city is actually going too far and way beyond the new state regulations in removing parking restrictions, kind of removing like minimum lot requirements, although that was kind of consensus, but extra square footage, things like that. Do you think the council struck the right balance? Like, I'm curious which side you would have voted for, the 5 or the 4 on that one.
Yeah, I think I was out of town that week, and I didn't read it as carefully as I should have. So let me give a general statement, because I don't have enough specifics to answer that exact question. Based on my experience and what I know of people who are building ADUs and where they are, we're really talking about a limited number. Right now it's in the 20s in terms of permits and applications. In these neighborhoods, I'm not aware of significant parking problems that would mean that relaxing the parking restriction wasn't okay. So the 5 was to say we're fine with being more permissive.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah.
I would have been on the side of the 5.
Okay.
Because I want to encourage that. I want to encourage that kind of construction. It's a small footprint. It's not visible from the street. And fundamentally, it gives families flexibility.
When you say affordable housing, what do you define affordable?
Yeah, for me, it's below market rate housing. I think that's where the city should really focus its funds and its efforts. And nobody else really pushes below market rate housing. I'm a little concerned we passed this affordable housing overlay with 120% of average income, which starts to look an awful lot like market rate housing. And I'm concerned that we made it harder to find places for true below market rate housing because market rate housing projects will compete for that land, basically. So again, I think we've gotten a little fuzzy in some of our arguments over housing. I think a lot of people who invest in the community and live in an R1 neighborhood expected to say largely the same. And I think that the R1 residential neighborhoods should largely say the same. I mean, we passed the ADU ordinance. We're seeing, a decent number of applications for ADUs. And I think we're going to refine that over time. But in terms of like rezoning an R1 neighborhood as an R2 or an R4, I don't think that will happen. And I certainly wouldn't support that happening. Mm-hmm. But in places where we have multi-family housing, again, going to an R20, maybe that makes sense. But I don't think that's really the barrier today. I think part of it's towing the line on limiting office development so that doing residential development becomes more attractive. We haven't seen a ton of market rate residential projects coming to us. And I think part of that is because people are hopeful that they can build more profitable office buildings.
Recently, you just made the observation that we need, in general, more housing. So,
yeah. So again, I think the market needs to figure out how to build the market rate housing. I do support like the teacher housing project that Joe Smitting is proposing. But I think those projects, that project basically getting the land for free, and that's what kind of makes that project work. It's really hard to see if a private development is truly market rate like how you have it so that it just doesn't go to the highest bidder. I mean, part of that was this idea about kind of renter protections. I mean, we have a lot of people in town who have rented for a long time, and you'd like to be able to people to have kind of stability and kind of where they live if they're paying the rent and able to pay reasonable rent increases. Not just be pushed out of town because somebody can charge much more and there are other people willing to pay much more.
Valley produces jobs 5 times faster than dwelling units. No community can keep up with that without massive external investments. The grand jury report that we reviewed came back, and I think it was sort of all over the map. But I thought one of the interesting things they said, you solved the whole affordable housing problem in the South Bay for $30 billion. Okay, right? Which is consistent with sort of how I think of this is, most of this stuff in the end of the day is a money problem. And the problem with below market rate housing is not, setbacks, it's how you're going to pay for it, right? And but the Valley produces, demand for housing 5 times faster than it produces actual housing, right? And so what happens is that, I actually think at the high end, the housing market actually sort of works, right? I mean, because Facebook couldn't hire people, right, if they didn't pay, right? Okay, so they actually get their employees. The people that get squeezed out are the people that are in the bottom 2/3, 4/5, or something like that, which is sort of everybody else. The hairdressers and the postal workers and the veterinary technicians and the school teachers and the bus drivers and sort of everybody else, right? And those people get driven into smaller spaces and farther away, right? I think everybody should worry about this, even the people that benefit from that situation, right? The way it goes, which is where the wealth gets generated, because it's not going to be scalable forever, okay? So if you really want to scale and keep the party going, we have a revenue and expense issue. That's my macro view. So if you come to the premise that the Valley produces a lot of wealth, but it doesn't spend enough on its housing and transportation costs, right? Then it's hard not to escape the conclusion to say, we ought to try to move some of that around a little bit. And so impact fees, okay, because the places that get piled up is primarily in tech, to some extent healthcare, right, and commercial real estate in particular, right? So we ought to try to move some of that and fund some of this stuff. And so in my mind, that's the argument for things like impact fees, right? So I think we ought to raise impact fees and spend it on housing and transportation.
I ran 4 years ago on slowing down office development and adding housing, adding accessory dwelling units, studios, 1-bedrooms, near transit, et cetera. I talked a lot about the need to address the jobs housing imbalance on both sides because it's severe, and I still am convinced it is the origin of our skyrocketing, is the primary origin of our skyrocketing housing costs and of our traffic and parking problems. And so, if that's the problem that we're trying to solve, you and I have talked about this in the past. My approach to policymaking is to say, okay, let's figure out the vision and what's the policy, what's the goal we're trying to achieve, and then I'm very open-minded about what policies are best to achieve that goal. I'm pragmatic about what policies we can actually get passed and will be stable and will be effective, or things that we can implement. Last year, a couple of my colleagues and I worked with. We talked to nonprofit, for-profit developers, talked to staff, talked to housing advocates, and we basically looked at our zoning code and said, what are all the things that Palo Alto does that makes it hard to build housing instead of offices or incentivizes offices before housing? And what are the things that we're doing that would incentivize like a big, $15,000 a month or $10,000 a month penthouse, as opposed to more reasonably sized, studios and 1-bedrooms.
So that's what you're referring to, is that kind of thing.
Yeah, and so we introduced a colleague's memo, basically listing a lot of things that we thought were problem points, where our existing policies, our existing zoning code, incentivizes the things we don't need and discourages the things we do need, and that's now working its way through as the housing work plan.
So can you point to any new housing development in neighboring cities that have actually resulted in housing units available to renters at that lower end of the income spectrum?
Well, the lower end of the market rate is not the lower end of the renters. The lower end of renters in our area frankly have to be in subsidized housing. And that's why we
I
do that
understand
too.
that, and I'm not asking about that.
So what I would actually point to is just a couple blocks away here at Page Mill and El Camino. It hasn't been put on the market yet. but we're talking about studios and one bedrooms, and I'm really proud of what we did there because that's a development that was originally going to be a bunch of jobs and a little bit of office, or a little bit of housing, and I led my colleagues in pushing back against that in a pre-screening and saying that's not what we're interested in doing. The lower end of the market in Palo Alto isn't affordable. It's just the lower end of the market. That's why you also need affordable, subsidized, or BMR housing. But the part of the reason why we need that lower end of the market, even though it's, by my standards at least, it's still not affordable, is that if you have that coming on the market, then people who can afford that will move into there. It won't cause gentrification by moving into the other older units that are more naturally affordable that are on the market.